Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about squad members in Mass Effect 2 Legendary Edition, going down a trip of nostalgia lane. And in this video I want to talk about the best and the worst squad members from a gameplay standpoint. Doesn't have anything to do with their voice actors, their story, just how good they are from a gameplay perspective, from a combat perspective. It should be noted that I'm only considering the insanity difficulty level. On lower difficulty levels, things are going to be very, very different indeed than they are on insanity. In large part because enemies do have shields far more often than they do on lower difficulty levels, like low-level grunts on lower difficulties don't all have shields, whereas on higher difficulties, pretty much every single enemy has a barrier or a shield of some kind of description. So it is going to change things around. For instance, biotics may be more useful on lower difficulties than they are on insanity. Also, the way squad members handle weapons and their accuracy, the damage they do, the amount of shots they are firing, their rate of fire, is going to vary between higher difficulties and lower difficulties. That's how the difficulty modifier used to work in Mass Effect 2. I'm not quite entirely certain my Legendary Edition, but I did dig into the files of Mass Effect 2 back in the day, and I can tell you that's how things work. Weapons are going to be an important factor on this list. Beyond just the skills that individual squad members have, the types of weapons they can use has a major impact, as it does in every single Mass Effect game. If I request new squad members here, for instance, someone like Miranda can only use submachine guns and heavy pistols, whereas someone like Garrus can use assault rifles and sniper rifles, so can Zaeed. And it's that weapon selection that does matter a great deal. But which weapons are the best and which are the worst? Well, the best are both assault rifles and sniper rifles in the hands of squad mates. Specifically, the Mattock heavy rifle is the best gun, I think, overall at the moment that you can give a squad member. Because squad members with this rifle will do a significant amount of damage, will fire it pretty accurately, and will just use it far better than any other choice of assault rifle, or most choices of guns in general. Shotguns are less useful for squad members because shotguns need to be pretty close to do a good amount of damage, the exception of course being the GEF plasma shotgun. The problem is squad members generally don't fully utilize the power of the GEF plasma shotgun, so a lot of it goes to waste. So squad members that rely primarily on shotguns are going to do less damage than those with assault rifles. Sniper rifles can be pretty good, in particular the M29 and Scissor sniper rifle. Now for Shepard, you don't want to use this gun because it's an ammo hog. It uses a lot of ammo and it doesn't replenish that many through clips. However, squad members don't care about ammo, and instead what they get is a highly accurate gun that fires 3 shots with each pull of the trigger, which is great for squad members because they don't fire as often as you do. But with the Incisor, they've got a highly accurate, high damage rifle in their hands. In fact, the M29 Incisor in Legendary Edition is actually worse, I think, than it used to be in Mass Effect 2. The reason it's worse is because difficulty modifiers affect damage, accuracy, rate of fire, etc. Well, the Incisor wasn't affected by this because it was a DLC weapon, and the way they handled it, I think they forgot to introduce the difficulty modifiers, but the way they ended up handling it is it just wasn't affected by that. So squad members got the full power of the Incisor on every difficulty level, and because one of the major downsides of it, the ammo count, is removed by default for squad members, it becomes one of the best guns in the game, if not the best gun in the game, alongside the Mattock. Pistols are okay, though they don't hold a candle, of course, to assault rifles or sniper rifles. And of course you've got SMGs. Well, SMG choices are not great. Shuriken and Tempest are just pretty bad, and the Locust, while pretty decent, is still not as good as the dedicated assault rifle or as good as the Incisor. So what this really means is that squad members that can use assault rifles or sniper rifles, or ideally both, are generally going to be higher ranked than those that can't. There are, however, exceptions. And speaking of the biggest exception to the rule, it is Miranda. Miranda has bad weapon choices. She has an SMG and she has a pistol. However, her skills are so great that it doesn't really matter what weapons she can use because she more than makes it up with her selection of skills. She's got Overload, where I would recommend spending about 3 points and not necessarily going all the way, but she's got Overload to deal with shields. She's got Warp, in particular Heavy Warp, to do a significant amount of damage to both HP bars and armor bars. And then she's got Slam as her loyalty skill, which just isn't that great because it won't work on armored or shielded targets, but it's still a choice. But most crucially, she's got Cerberus Leader. And Cerberus Leader, of all the squad skill lines, is actually the very best in the entire game. It increases her HP and her damage, but also increases the squad HP and squad damage. Going all the way to rank 4, where you have a choice between either increasing more HP or more damage. What this means is, if you have Miranda in your squad, you, as Shepard, are going to do 15% more damage or have more HP. Well, you're always going to have more HP and more damage, but you have choice between more HP and more damage. This makes Miranda formidable as a squad member. She won't do a significant amount of weapon damage herself, though she will do certainly a good amount of ability damage, even if she doesn't have a skill to increase said ability damage. But she is quite useful to have in a firefight. And I say this as someone who honestly doesn't like using Miranda, but I would remiss to not put her at the very top of this list because she is that good. 15% weapon damage is nothing to sneeze at. Now, number 2, we have Zaeed Massani. I'm sure some people are going to be disappointed about Garrus not being at the number 2 spot, but to be quite honest, Zaeed is just better in many significant ways than Garrus is. Not necessarily in the skills he has, though having heavy disruptor ammo does give him an advantage against shielded enemies and mechanical enemies, and there's quite a few of those in the game, though not necessarily the collectors themselves. He's not the best against the collectors, but he is really good against the armies of mercenaries, Blue Suns, Eclipse that you're going to be dealing with, some Geth, and the many mechs that you'll be fighting throughout this game. Concussive Shot is a good disable ability, a decent enough disable ability, though you shouldn't spend too many points in that. And then Inferno Grenade can help you against armor. But it's none of those skills that put Zaeed so high on this list. It's Mercenary Warlord. Mercenary Warlord gives Zaeed a ridiculous amount of weapon damage. If I'm not mistaken, it's the highest amount of weapon damage in the entire game, going all the way to plus 50% weapon damage. And with an Incisor Sniper Rifle and a Mattock, and you can use both, he is going to do a ridiculous amount of damage in any firefight you bring this guy in. I guess it makes sense. Zaeed is supposed to be the most hardened mercenary of the entire squad, the guy with the most experience in the entire squad, and it really shows in his skill line. This guy is a beast with the proper equipment. He just annihilates entire squads potentially on his own, and he can hold his own in a lot of ways. He's also pretty decently durable, though he's not the most durable squad member you can have in this game. Number 3, we have good old faithful Garrus Vakarian. Garrus is not going to be as good against shielded targets as Zaeed, but Garrus is absolutely going to be great against armored targets, far more so than Zaeed in certain ways, if you build him correctly. He has Concussive Shot, Overload, Turian Renegade, and Tungsten ammo. You don't want to spend too many points in Concussive Shot. You do want to get Overload, 3 points in Overload, then Turian Renegade 4 points, and 4 points in Tungsten ammo, which is his loyalty mission skill. Overload obviously will help you with shields, though it's not going to be as good as Disruptor ammo can be with a Mattock. Turian Renegade is pretty decent because it does give him that 25% weapon damage that you can get access to. Of course, you could also increase his HP, but you don't necessarily want to do that. And then, of course, Tungsten ammo is going to give him a substantial benefit against armor and against HP. Both Zaeed and Garrus are great with assault rifles, and they're both great with sniper rifles. The way I see Garrus is that Garrus versus Zaeed is better against shielded targets, whereas Garrus is better against heavily armored targets. I would say in many cases Zaeed ends up being better because you fight more mechanical enemies and more shielded enemies than you do armored targets, but if you're facing heavily armored targets, Garrus is your man. They're actually pretty much on the same level. All the snipers are actually very equal to each other in a lot of ways, at least those that can also use assault rifles. But yeah, Garrus earns the number 3 spot from my perspective. The overload helps him deal with shielded targets, though again, it's not as effective as some other choices could be. And number 4, we have Legion. Now, Legion is an interesting choice because he's very hard to acquire, and honestly, if you're trying to keep your entire crew alive, you probably will acquire him and only do one single mission with him, which is his loyalty mission. Though you can use a save game modifier to get Legion to prevent the crew kidnapping, so you can use Legion in more main story missions, which is actually more interesting to do. By the way, he has the ability to do AI hacking, which is very situational, but he does have combat drones, so you can distract enemies using that, allowing you and him to line up your shots uninterrupted. Then he does have Geth Assassin. Geth Assassin, 25% weapon damage, power recharge rate, so you can use that combat drone more, and then improved Geth shield boost. Now, the Geth shield boost is great, not because of the survival aspect, though obviously Legion is going to benefit from that extra shield. I think he has the strongest shield strength in the entire game. But what's great about Geth shield boost is that it also gives him 10% weapon damage while it's active. Well, this is not as good as what Garrus and Zaeed have with their ammo types. It is still pretty decent, and Legion actually, in a practical term, because of the distraction the combat drone will provide, Legion will actually be able to survive better than either of them just by distracting enemies with drones. And so will you, due to the distraction those drones will provide. The drones he has aren't the best, because you do want to get Geth Assassin and improve Geth Shield maximized, so you can't get the final skill with the drones, but it's still a good and useful distraction that Legion does provide. And he can use both assault rifles and snipers, as can Garrus, as can Zaeed. So Legion, number 4 on this list. At number 5, it's Thane. Thane can't use an assault rifle, he has to make do with an SMG, so he is going to be worse than Garrus, Legion, and Zaeed. But he does still have a sniper rifle, so that means you can use the Incisor on him, and that's still pretty good enough. He does have heavy warp to deal with heavily armored targets, pretty useful there. He can throw enemies around once they're down to their HP bar, that can be pretty decent. And then he does have Drell Marksman, which gives him 50% weapon damage. The same as Zaeed, though of course Zaeed does have a better ammo type than Thane does, and he can also use assault rifles. But as I mentioned, the snipers are not really that far apart, really. It's just Thane is slightly worse off because he can't use assault rifles. And his ammo type, Shredder R ammo, just isn't that great, because HP bar is the least significant aspect in this entire game. In fact, the HP bar is the last thing you really care about. Once you whittle down enemies to their HP bar, you've won the fight, really. So having an ammo type that improves that is just nowhere near as useful. Warp is nice, though, and 50% weapon damage with an Incisor sniper rifle is nothing to sneeze at. Hell, 50% SMG damage with a Locust SMG is also not something to sneeze at. So yeah, Thane is number 5 on this list. Just gets a lot of weapon damage, doesn't necessarily have the best weapon types, doesn't have necessarily the best skill set overall, but it does have a good amount of damage from Drell Marksman. And I would recommend you get Drell Marksman. Don't laugh at the idea of getting 50% weapon damage. He's a bit squishy, though. He's a bit on the squishier side, unfortunately. And number 6, it is Kasumi Goto. I admit I don't really like using her, but she's got a great deal of survivability, can do a good amount of damage with her abilities, and can really help with disabling enemies. Her main ability is Shadow Strike, which can be upgraded at rank 4 to either do a significant amount of damage or do a bit less damage than this 550, but basically refresh its cooldown or reduce it by 80% if it does kill an enemy. So you can really use Kasumi as an assassin on the battlefield. Now, I personally prefer having Shadow Strike being available far more, or rather, I prefer having Shadow Strike doing far more, doing 100 points more of damage than just getting a cooldown replenishment, because, hey, 100 damage, gonna use that more, and gonna have more use of that, generally speaking, than only being able to make use of that lower cooldown in certain situations. She does have Overload, which does help you deal with shields on enemies. She does have Flashbang Grenade, that's her loyalty skill. And honestly, you do want to do that loyalty mission very quickly, because the SMG you get from it is going to be really useful with every squad member that can use an SMG. But the Flashbang Grenade, even if you're not going to spend a lot of skill points in it, it is going to be useful at disabling enemies and just causing havoc on the battlefield. That's what Kasumi excels at. She's not going to be great in damage, she only has a pistol and an SMG, but she does have some pretty powerful skills, Shadow Strike and Overload in particular. Not the greatest in every situation, but certainly capable of holding her own and being a very useful distraction on the battlefield. AI just can't react very well with Kasumi in a lot of ways, I think. So she's actually a lot more durable than her HP and shields actually suggest. And number 7, we have Grunt, the most durable companion that you do have in the entire game. Grunt is pretty straightforward. He's a berserker. He's a frontline fighter. He's very large, takes a lot of damage, but he's able to soak it. He has Fortification as a skill, which gives him a substantial benefit in terms of that survivability. So he gets 75% benefit with Fortification for there. Then, of course, he can get HP regeneration and 50% more HP with Krogan Warlord. He does have Inferno ammo, which will be useful against armored targets. He can use assault rifles and shotguns, and you can also make a special Claymore shotgun that he can use, which means that he is even deadlier in a melee fight, because blast from a Claymore in melee range is going to do a significant amount of damage, even if fired by a squad mate. See, shotguns aren't bad per se in the hands of squad mates, it's just that they generally don't use them properly. Well, Grunt loves to get stuck in against enemies. He's gonna get in a melee fight, and he's gonna blow them to smithereens with that Claymore. So he's able to take a lot of damage, get in nice, close, and personal with enemies, survive that, even on Insanity, and do a significant amount of damage. I admit, I don't like to use him. I prefer to kill enemies from a distance with my snipers, but Grunt does certainly have an enormous amount of survivability, far more so than you have, far more so than anyone else has in the game. Doesn't have the best skill set, but what he does have works pretty well for his playstyle. And number 8, we have Tali Zorah Vas Normandy. From a story perspective, Tali is one of my favorite characters, but from a gameplay perspective, unfortunately, she's generally been one of the weaker squad mates in Mass Effect 2 and 3 as well. That's because she has shotguns and pistols, which aren't the best weapons to have on a squad mate, which severely limit her usefulness. Grunt at least has an assault rifle, so when the shotgun's not going to cut it, switch to the assault rifle, do a decent amount of damage. Though with Grunt, yeah, throw him in melee. Tali's main role is to serve as a distraction. She's pretty easy to take down because she has only 240 HP and 350 shields, but she can be a great distraction. She has drones, AI hacking, area drain as a loyalty skill, and the Quarian mechanic, although that's one of the choices you can get. Drones are great, can do a good amount of damage, but more importantly serve as a superb distraction. Explosive drone, oof, exploding in the middle of an enemy group, staggering all of them, pretty useful to have. Though you could increase the drone survivability as well. I do prefer the explosion aspect, to be honest. AI hacking, pretty useless unless you're dealing with mechs and Geth. And yes, there are a lot of mechs in this game, but there's also a lot of missions where you're not facing that. And when it comes to skill choices, you can either max out free skills, or you can spend points in all four, but not be able to max out more than two, like with the case with Grunt over here. I do prefer with Tali to max out 3 of her skills. The drone for the distraction effect, the coordinate mechanic for the weapon damage, and the power duration, though I admit the power duration is not necessarily the greatest stat for Tali. It would have actually been better to have power recharge rate. And then energy drain, which can help with her survivability as well as weaken enemies that she's dealing with. But Tali's main purpose is support and distraction. She does use the shotgun, so you could send her closer ahead to the enemy and rely on the energy drain ability and the drone to keep her alive while you're dealing the real damage with another squad member. That's her purpose in combat. For my part, I do prefer bringing Zaeed and Garrus, or Zaeed and Thane, and just slaughtering everything before they even reach us. But Tali can work quite well as a distraction. That's her purpose in combat. So, number 8, Tali Zorah Vas Norman. At number 9, we have Samara. Also, you can put Mordin on the same ranking if you do decide to get her, because it's going to be the same thing, pretty much. Samara does have some useless abilities in both throw and pull. The reason they're useless is because of the many shields that enemies do have in Mass Effect 2 on Insanity difficulty. However, she can use assault rifles, so she is capable of doing a decent amount of damage, though she's obviously not going to compare to someone like, say, Zaeed. But she does have still 25% weapon damage, as well as a good amount of power recharge rate. And then there's her loyalty ability, Reeve. Reeve increases her HP, or regenerates her HP, and gives her an HP bonus. Now, her HP is pretty weak, so that is a downside when dealing with Samara, but she is certainly capable of doing a decent amount of damage courtesy of Reeve. But her usefulness is certainly going to be more limited, and she is going to do better, I feel, against armored targets than against shielded targets. Although, of course, she is still going to be able to hold her own. She's decent, she just doesn't have any special strengths, I'd argue. And Reeve doesn't make up for the fact that she does have a fairly low HP pool. At number 10, we have Mordin, who is the one character that can die the easiest in Mass Effect 2 in the Suicide mission, because he's got a very low amount of durability. From a perspective there in that mission, when it comes to the points each squad member is assigned. He does have low HP. He doesn't have great survivability. His weapon choices are limited, though he can do a decent amount of damage to armor targets, and he can also be useful against HP with Cryoblast. Now, unfortunately, you can't max out both Heavy Incinerate and Cryoblast due to the nature of skill points, and Neural Shock just isn't necessarily that great of a skill to actually invest points in. That is a bit of a downside. Like, if you could max out both Cryoblast and Heavy Incinerate, he might be better. As for Salarian Savant, weapon damage, shields, HP, which does help increase his survivability because he is pretty frail. Though honestly, I think Mordin would have benefited more from either power damage or power recharge rate. Mordin is thus one of the more useless characters when it comes to bringing to a fight. Mordin's value really is more from a story perspective rather than a gameplay perspective in Mass Effect 2. Finally, for the two most useless characters in Mass Effect 2 Legendary Edition, we of course have Jack and number 11. The problem with Jack is she can only use shotguns and pistols, and because squad members don't do very well with either shotguns or pistols, she's not going to be that great from a combat perspective. On top of that, for all the biotic power that she's supposed to have from a story perspective, she actually doesn't have a great skill set. The problem with Shockwave and Pull is, well, shields, armor are going to interfere with that, barriers are going to interfere with that, and just make them far less useful to have. Jack is a bit more useful on a lower difficulty, but even then there are better squad mates to have. The one thing she does provide is warp ammo, which if you can max out, I haven't here, but I barely bother using Jack in any playthrough. But warp ammo can deal a decent amount of damage, and if you do give squad warp ammo, that can be beneficial in certain situations, especially if you don't have it, any type of ammo type on a character, or if a squad member can't provide squad ammo. Getting Jack just to get squad warp ammo could be worth it in certain situations, though you're probably better off using that as your own loyalty ability as opposed to using it on to just bring Jack to a mission. And then we have Primal Vanguard, which gives her HP, weapon damage, and power recharge time, but her powers are not great. Her weapon damage is also not great, so Jack's certainly one of the weakest squad members in the entire game, but not as weak as the final squad member on this list. Finally, at number 12, the worst squad member from all perspectives, gameplay and story, Jacob. Jacob is probably the worst squad member in the entire Mass Effect series. He's just useless. Like Jack, he can only use shotguns and pistols, and squad members just aren't going to do a great job with that. Jack has one saving grace in the fact that she can give you warp ammo, but even then she's not that great. Jacob, however, is actually in some ways more useless. Yes, he does have Inferno ammo, which you could argue is pretty decent, but it's not the best ammo type in the game, and you can get it yourself through other measures. So incendiary ammo, but okay, it's decent enough damage, I suppose, if you want to argue that. But on top of that, Jacob just doesn't have anything going for him. His Cerberus Specialist skill just increases his HP and weapon damage, and his loyalty skill, Barrier, just gives him more durability. The problem with that is, while this will increase his durability, he's not going to hold a candle to someone like Grunt, for instance, or the value that someone like Legion or Tali can provide with their drones, and Legion in particular, because he's got assault rifles, sniper rifles, and the shield, is just flat out better in every single way. Jacob is just not a character worth bringing in any mission, for any reason. Not for story missions, not for story reasons, not for gameplay reasons. It's just best to forget that Jacob ever existed in the Mass Effect series. I think that is where we should put him. I mean, Jack at least has some redeeming qualities from a story perspective. Jacob doesn't even have that. And that's all there is to it. Costine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and stay tuned for more. Mass Effect 3 going to soon be done.